January 15th, 1919. 12:28 in the afternoon. Commercial Street, Boston's North End. A storage tank 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide tears apart at the base. 2.3 million gallons of crude molasses release simultaneously. The wave is 25 feet high where it begins. It moves at 35 miles per hour. It sweeps away a section of elevated railway. It buries the fire station next door. It collapses 2 houses. It kills horses where they stand. It covers everything within a city block in a layer of brown syrup that, within minutes, begins to cool and stiffen in the January air. 21 people die. Many of them drown in molasses, not in deep water, in syrup that hardens around them faster than rescuers can pull them free. The tank belonged to the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. They had known it was leaking since the day it was built. The tank had been poorly designed, quickly constructed, and never properly tested. Local residents in the North End had noticed it leaking almost immediately after it was filled for the first time in 1915. Children collected molasses from the base of the tank and sold it. Families in the neighborhood used the leaked product in their cooking. The leaks were that visible, that constant. The company's response was to paint the tank brown so the stains would not show. They never reinforced it, never properly tested its structural integrity. When neighbors and workers reported sounds of groaning metal, creaking under pressure changes, the company dismissed every concern. The tank held warm molasses in winter and cold air in summer, expanding and contracting, stressing the same seams over and over. It was not built to survive that for 4 years. On January 15th, it did not. 3 things about the molasses flood that go deeper than the obvious disaster. The first, when the lawsuits began, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company did not admit any negligence. Instead, its lawyers put forward an alternative theory that the tank had been destroyed by a bomb planted by anarchists. Galleonist bombings were real and active in Boston at the time. The company argued that Italian anarchists in the North End had targeted the tank as part of an ongoing domestic terrorism campaign. The strategy was calculated. It pointed blame at the immigrant community that lived in the very neighborhood the flood had destroyed. The second, the legal case, took 6 years to resolve. The plaintiff's legal team hired Arthur Dolan, a meticulous Boston attorney who spent those 6 years compiling engineering testimony, structural analysis, and survivor accounts. The technical experts he brought in found 0 physical evidence of any explosion from outside the tank. They found overwhelming evidence of deficient construction and metal fatigue. In 1925, a court-appointed auditor ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. The third, the company paid approximately $628,000 in settlements to victims, equivalent to roughly $11 million today. The payment came only because of 6 years of legal work by private lawyers in a case the company had spent years trying to have dismissed. It remains one of the earliest significant examples of a corporation being held liable in American courts for negligent construction of an industrial structure. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company had built the tank in 1915 under pressure to keep up with wartime demand for industrial alcohol, a component used in the manufacture of munitions, torpedoes, and various military products. The tank was designed to hold molasses brought in by ship from the Caribbean, which would then be fermented and distilled into the alcohol needed for the war effort. It was an enormous undertaking built in a short period in a dense urban neighborhood with the kind of corners cut that wartime production pressure made easy to justify internally. The engineer responsible for the tank's design was not, by most accounts, a specialist in large-scale liquid storage structures. The steel used for the tank walls was, according to later analysis, of inconsistent quality and improperly tested for the specific combination of stresses the tank would experience. The expansion and contraction of warm molasses in summer versus cold molasses in winter would stress the seams differently in different seasons. Nobody had calculated those differential stresses into the tank's design in any meaningful way. From the time the tank was first filled in late 1915, the leaks were observable to anyone who walked past on Commercial Street. Workers at the facility knew about them. The local fire station, whose building sat immediately adjacent to the tank, knew about them. Children from the North End neighborhood collected the leaked molasses, which was essentially a free food product given the neighborhood's economic conditions. The company acknowledged the leaks internally but characterized them as a normal feature of a large tank of this type, rather than a structural warning sign. The North End in 1919 was one of Boston's most densely populated neighborhoods, home primarily to Italian and Jewish immigrant communities who had settled there over the preceding decades. The neighborhood's streets were narrow, its buildings close together, its commercial activity concentrated along the waterfront streets where the docks and rail lines met. The tank's position on Commercial Street placed it in the middle of this activity, not on the industrial periphery, but in the heart of a working neighborhood, where children played, people walked to work, and the daily life of a dense urban community proceeded within a few feet of its walls. The fire station at Engine 31 sat immediately adjacent to the tank. Firefighters stationed there had watched the tank for years, had reported the leaks through their own channels, had lived and worked in its shadow. On the afternoon of January 15th, the men of Engine 31 were among the first affected when the tank failed. Their building was struck by the initial wave, their equipment buried under molasses. Their ability to respond to the disaster they were in the middle of immediately compromised. In the weeks before January 15th, 1919, the tank had been refilled with molasses arriving by ship from Cuba, a particularly large delivery, filling the tank closer to capacity than it had been in some time. Temperatures in Boston in the days immediately before the disaster had fluctuated significantly, warming from bitter cold to above freezing and back. Each temperature change caused the molasses to expand and contract, stressing the already compromised seams. Workers later testified to hearing unusual sounds from the tank in the period before the failure: metallic groaning, the creaking of stressed steel. At 12:28 p.m. on January 15th, the tank failed at its base. The sudden release of more than 2 million gallons of molasses at a relatively high temperature into the cold January air created a wave that moved with enough force to tear sections of the elevated railway structure off. Its supports, the fire station next door, was partially crushed. Houses on the block were struck and partially collapsed. The nature of the molasses itself became one of the defining elements of the disaster's horror. Warm molasses in contact with cold January air begins to cool and thicken almost immediately. The initial wave had the force to throw people and horses off their feet and carry them significant distances. But as the molasses spread and began to cool, it became progressively harder to move through, harder to escape from. People who had been knocked down by the initial surge found themselves unable to stand back up, the thickening syrup gripping at clothing, legs, and arms. Rescue workers who waded in to pull people free found themselves also slowing down as the molasses stiffened around them. The Boston police, Red Cross volunteers, naval personnel from a nearby facility, and ordinary bystanders all joined the rescue effort, many of them sinking to mid-thigh in cooling molasses as they worked. The bodies of horses were visible in the molasses for hours after the disaster, the animals having been caught in the wave near the stables and freight operations along the waterfront. The elevated railway structure, sections of which had been torn from their supports by the wave, draped twisted ironwork across the scene. The fire station remained partially embedded in cooling molasses through the initial phases of the rescue operation. The cleanup operation took weeks. Workers used salt water from the harbor, rinsed and scraped, worked around the clock, and still found molasses in cracks and corners for months afterward. The harbor itself was discolored through the spring. The official cleanup cost was substantial and was borne largely by the company whose tank had failed. One of the few early examples of a polluter being required to fund remediation of the contamination they caused. 21 people died, many of them from drowning in the molasses itself, others from injuries sustained when the wave struck buildings and structures. 150 more were injured, with varying severity. The cleanup of the harbor and the surrounding streets took weeks of sustained effort, involving tens of thousands of labor hours. The harbor reportedly ran brown for months during warm weather as molasses continued to leach from the mud of the harbor bottom. The legal proceedings centered on the 6-year investigation conducted by a court-appointed auditor, Hugh Ogden, who methodically worked through thousands of pages of engineering testimony, structural analysis, and witness accounts. The company's anarchist bomb theory was tested thoroughly and found to have no supporting physical evidence. The pattern of the tank's failure, the nature of the debris, and the absence of any scorching or blast scarring all pointed to a structural failure from within, rather than an external explosion. The company's attempt to use the real anxieties of the era about immigrant anarchism as a legal shield failed when put against careful engineering analysis. The ruling against the company in 1925 established several precedents that would matter in subsequent decades of American tort law. Most significantly, that a corporation could be held liable for the consequences of negligent construction, even when the failure was not immediately visible and occurred years after the structure was built. The case is taught in American law schools today, usually noted as an early milestone in product liability and negligent construction jurisprudence, with a somewhat unusual detail of involving 2 million gallons of syrup. On the corner of Commercial Street in Boston's North End, there is a small plaque marking the location of the disaster. It is easy to miss. The neighborhood looks nothing like it did in 1919. The elevated railway that wave partially destroyed was eventually demolished entirely. The site where the tank stood is now a park and recreational area near the waterfront. On warm summer days in the North End, some residents claim they can still faintly smell molasses rising from the ground. Scientists have periodically investigated this claim. The results have been inconclusive. The legal precedent set by the molasses case reverberated through American tort law in ways that extended far beyond Boston's North End. The finding that a corporation could be held liable for structural negligence in an industrial installation, not just for individual employee error, but for the systematic failure to build something correctly in the first place, was a principle that expanded the legal landscape for industrial accident victims in the decades that followed. It is a precedent whose origin story involves molasses, Italian immigrants, an anarchist conspiracy theory, and 6 years of painstaking engineering testimony. That combination is not an accident of history. It is an accurate picture of how accountability for industrial negligence has typically worked in America, slowly expensively, and only when private lawyers chose to fight for it. If you want to understand the disasters where the evidence of danger was visible every single day, and the company's response was to paint it brown so no one would notice, subscribe. Every week, a story that was hidden in plain sight.